right, well, let me welcome all of you again. My name is Trip Healy, lead pastor here at Ridge Church. If I hadn't met you, I hope that you'll stick around long enough. I'll be out in the hallway shaking some hands, and so my favorite thing to do in the world. But I really would like to meet you. Hope that you'll take the opportunity to do that. If you're here for the first time, so glad that you're here with us. We're in part 3 of a series called See Your World. And the idea behind this series is just to recognize, really encourage all of us that as Christians, that we have a responsibility to be aware of what's going on around us, that we need to know what's going on, not just in our own lives and in our own circle and, being very nearsighted and seeing what's going on just around us, but actually all around us, to be able to see the need that exists, to know what's going on in other people's lives, to know what's going on in our city and in our community, around our country, even around the world, to know those things, to know kind of the direction that our culture is shifting and moving in. It's important that we know those things. In other words, we need to be aware so that we can make a difference. You see, the thing is, if you can't see something, then you can't make any kind of change. You can't change something that you're not aware of. Does that make sense? You can't reach something that you don't see. You can't love something that you don't see. And so we've made the statement that all of us need to learn how to open our eyes and see our world. That as Christians, as believers, as Christ followers, as the church as a whole, we've got to be able to open up our eyes and see our world, because we have a responsibility to make a difference. And if that's true, if it's true, and hopefully I've made the case that it is over the last couple of weeks, if it's true that our responsibility is to see our world, to know what's going on in our world so that we can ultimately make a difference in other people's lives, then what I want to talk about today is this idea of having influence in people's lives. Because if we're going to make a difference, if we're going to know what's going on, then if we're going to be able to speak into somebody's life, then we've got to be able to have some level of influence. Does that make sense? We've got to be able to influence is essentially permission to speak into somebody's life. That's what influence is. It's not just an automatic thing. Influence is consistency over time. It's earned. It's the ability to be able to compel somebody and move them in a different direction. That's what influence is. It's to lead somebody and maybe compel them to believe something they've never believed before, or just to consider something they've never considered before. That requires influence. You have to be able to kind of pull people along. And ultimately, this is what happens if we don't have it. If we don't maintain influence, and I'm talking about Christians in the church, then we will remain ineffective. We will not be able to make a difference. We may know what's going on. We may have our eyes wide open and see all the need around us. But if we're not maintaining, gaining trust, respect, and influence in other people's lives, then we're not going to be able to speak into their lives. And man, parents, come on, like if you're a parent, you know how this works. When your kids are young, it doesn't really require influence to get them to obey you, right? You just kind of lay out the consequences. If you don't, then I will, something along those lines. And you can fill in the blank. You don't obey, then there will be consequences. And so kids, is like, okay, whatever you say, I want to avoid consequence. Well, unfortunately, parents realize that as their kids get older, that just doesn't really work for very long. And that when their kids become teenagers and maybe even young adults, they realize, hey, I don't want them to just do what I say because I said it, or, to obey me because they want to avoid some consequences. I actually want them to love me and to trust me and to respect me enough to want to do what I say. That's different, isn't it? That's ultimately what we want. Will you point? I feel like that has literally hit me right in the head. If you'll kind of point that down. It kind of feels good, but it makes noise up here. So, influence is ultimately what we try to gain. And here's the problem. As the church, it really applies the same way. That it's consistency over time. It's genuinely loving and caring for people and creating a path to influence somebody. But traditionally, historically, the church has oftentimes gotten this wrong. And I dare say that, my point of view is that so many, even today, still continue to do this. And maybe even the face of Christianity and church often has a tendency to be this way, that it's more, we try to influence based on condemnation and judgment. in kind of correcting behavior. Well, let me point out all of your wrongs and show you what the consequences are. That's the hellfire and brimstone. Let me show you where you're headed so that I can, taper your behavior and your lifestyle. And we try to influence through really ultimately this control and manipulation. We try to just control people. And it's so often the case, but ultimately that's not going to last. We know it's not, and it's not the way that we've been taught to lead and to guide people. That really it is about a trust relationship. It is earned, it's respect over time, and that's ultimately what I would love to see happen here. I would love to be that kind of church, the kind of church that creates influence in the lives of people, that loves first, that loves right out of the gate, right where you are, and then creates a relationship of trust so that we can then be able to speak into people's lives. That's kind of what we're doing. That's what we're about. And we want to figure out a way to do that. Because I think if we sacrifice that, if we sacrifice influence, then ultimately we sacrifice the ability to make a real difference in somebody's life. So the question, of course, in this culture, in the culture that we live in, where there's such negative perception about Christianity and churches and what it's all about, is it even possible? Like to really maintain any level of influence? I mean, have we kind of lost all hope as the church? Have we gone too far? Do people just have a horribly negative perception about the church and Christianity, so much so that we'll never be able to regain influence? And I don't think so if we can get some things right. That's why this is so important. That's why this matters. This is so core for who we are as a church. And a long time ago, we decided that we wanted to learn how to be a church that creates and maintains influence in the lives of people. But how do we do it? And I think there's some things that we can look at. There might be a lot of different potential answers here, but I want to try to get to the core of it, what really makes the difference in people's lives. I want to use a story from just kind of a snapshot from the life of a man named Daniel. You're probably very familiar. If you've been around a church at all, any length of time, then you know some about Daniel's story. But he lived about 2,500 or so years ago. And when he was a young man, a young teenager, he actually witnessed Babylon coming in and capturing and conquering. And they had been captured and conquered. Israel had actually been split into two kingdoms, Judah in the south, Israel in the north, and they had literally been, for the last couple of hundred years, had been conquered and captured and exiled over and over again. Well, now this was just kind of, almost commonplace, and Daniel was a young man when the Babylonian Empire came, had risen and become powerful, and they came in, captured Judah, and took Daniel. He was one of their foreign slaves. He became exiled, and he grew up, really spent his life in Babylon as a foreigner. Well, what's interesting is he spent the next 70 years of his life gaining influence somehow. That somehow over the course of those 70 years of his life, he began to serve and moved his way up the ranks and found him placed really in a position of authority and responsibility in the Babylonian Empire, even though he was a Jewish man. Matter of fact, he lived through 4 different administrations. Something was unique about Daniel. Well, at the beginning of chapter 6, which is where we're going to pick up, we find Daniel now witnessing not only the Babylonian Empire, but now the fall of the Babylonian Empire. And the Medo-Persian Empire had risen up, and they came in, and now they had conquered Babylon. So now Daniel is a displaced Jew in Babylon who has now been conquered by yet another group of people, another country, another nation, another kingdom. And so they came in and they took over power, and as you can imagine, they wanted to set things up according to their agenda and how they like to do things, and they placed a man named Darius as president, king over Babylon. And it was his responsibility to kind of set up shop, kind of restructure the government accordingly. And so that's what he began to do. And we find Daniel still in a unique position to have influence, even in that brand new administration. And so that's where we pick up the story. And just check this out. Let's listen to this story. So unique. Just try to read this with fresh eyes today. It pleased Darius, the king, to appoint 120 satraps, which were just imagine them being like governors, to rule throughout the kingdom. They all had, they sectioned it off into like 120 districts or regions or states, and they put rulers over each one of those, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. Well, the satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss, to them being those administrators. So Daniel was one of the 3 just underneath the king. I mean, this foreigner, this foreign slave, this brand new government has come in. They've taken over, they've conquered, and now they're setting up shop. And this foreigner, who's not even a resident or a citizen of Babylon, they've now placed him in charge. They don't even know him. They just kind of heard about him, perhaps through his 39 years of service under King Nebuchadnezzar and just how faithful he was. And so they place him. So if you can just imagine, like the state governors, if you can just imagine the way we do things, well, instead of a Senate and a House of Representatives, they place 3 administrators over, they kind of split those satraps up, 40 for you, 40 for you, 40 for you, and Daniel was one of those. Well, what's interesting is it didn't stop there because, of course, nobody really liked that. All these guys, they didn't know him, and yet Daniel was he was a foreigner, and yet he was over them, and they weren't real excited, but they didn't realize that it was actually about to get worse. Listen to this. Now, Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps and the other governors. In other words, he set himself apart. To be distinguished is to set yourself apart, to rise above the rest. You've gotten noticed. There's something uniquely different. You've distinguished yourself. And notice this, it was Daniel's choice to do so. Daniel so distinguished himself. There was something different about him, but it wasn't an accident. Daniel chose that. So much so, by his exceptional qualities, there was something so unique that he rose above the rest, that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. In other words, King Darius was saying, there is something, because maybe this has been just a short while and everything seems to be going very smoothly. Maybe a year or two into their occupation perhaps. And he sees that Daniel and everything under Daniel's care is flourishing and doing extremely well. He suffers no loss. He's like, so I basically see something so unique in Daniel, I want him to actually do my job with me. And so I'm going to put him above everybody, right alongside me. And of course, nobody was really excited about that. But there was something so unique. He so distinguished himself. He had these exceptional qualities. It was like, this is a guy, he shows up to work on time. Matter of fact, he's early. He stays late. He works really hard, keeps his head down. He doesn't whine and complain. He's got influence. People watch him. He manages all of his business and his personal affairs so well. People really trust him. There's just no discrepancy in who this man is. I want to put him in charge of everything. Here's what's so interesting, is Daniel did all of this in spite of the cultural climate in which he lived. Don't you know that Daniel worshiped the God of Israel still? And he was kind of a loner. He was it in a foreign country. And yet he chose to engage the culture in which he lived. He didn't resist it. He didn't try to defy it or rebel against it. He simply said, I'm gonna make a difference right where I am. In other words, I think this is the difference that Daniel realized. He said, if we're going to influence culture, then we have to create culture. I think he understood that. It's not to defy it or to go, there's a time for taking our stand and for speaking truth and never backing down from that. But at the same time, to so resist it and defy it and rebel against it that we have no influence. In other words, he was saying, I'm not just going to use my position of authority to make people do what I want them to do. He said, no, I'm just going to lead well. I'm going to serve well. I'm going to care for people well. I'm going to respect people. And consistency over time, I'm going to do things to the best of my ability, the absolute best of my ability. And I'm going to distinguish myself in such a way that it creates influence. Can you imagine if we began to do that? If we began to really engage our culture in such a way that we still had influence? I mean, the church once had that. The church once had primary influence over culture. It was a culture creator. And we've lost a lot of that. And I think Daniel, at this point, he understood that. I think he understood it. If I'm going to make a difference, I can't just run away from everything and defy and resist and rebel. I'm going to engage culture. And at this, the administrators and the satraps, everybody below Daniel who heard the news that he was going to get a raise and get a promotion, they tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. In other words, we're going to look for a discrepancy, a gap between who Darius thinks Daniel is publicly and who he really is privately. In other words, they're looking for a mess up in his integrity. Man, if we could just point something out, then we'll show that he's really not worth your time and effort. He's really not who he says he is. That's what they were looking for. And they had all the resources in the world to be able to find it. They had all the detectives, and they were, snooping around and digging, and they were, spying on him and watching how he lived his life and what he did, privately, and how he talked, and, who he was with and what he did. And yet, they were unable to do so. They were unable to figure out what they could point out as grounds for dismissing Daniel or discrediting Daniel. They couldn't do it. Instead, they could find no corruption in him. Can you imagine somebody really going to town and studying our lives and intentionally looking for a way to discredit us, and yet finding no corruption in us? Like they've been tapping our phone. They see all of our browser history. They know exactly where we go after work, how we act and interact at work, and who we spend time with, and how we talk and communicate with people, and how we treat our kids and if they were able to see into all that, would this be the result? And I'm talking to Christians here. Would this be the result? Because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Now listen to those words. I think these are the distinguishing characteristics, the exceptional qualities of Daniel, is that there was no corruption in him. In other words, he had good character. He was a man who had good character, but he also had competency. He was a man of flawless character. They could find no corruption in him. He really was a good man. His private life matched his public life. His walk matched his talk. He was a man of character, but get this, it doesn't end there. It's like, well, yeah, he's a good Christian. That's kind of the way we talk nowadays, right? Well, yeah, there's such a good man, such a good guy. Such a good guy. But he was also competent. I love this. It's like there was no corruption, but also no negligence. In other words, he was competent. He knew what he was doing. He was smart. He was the man for the job. He was the first there and the last to leave. He wasn't just a good man and then like a terrible surgeon, right? Well, he's got the fish on his door, so I guess I'm going to use him. Like that's kind of, we kind of default. It's like, well, we'll use it as an excuse. Well, I'm a Christian. I don't have to be a good plumber. Like, no. That's not, we don't want that, right? We want somebody of good character, but also that's extremely competent. We want them to know what they're doing. Those are really the people that influence us, isn't it? That we want to aspire to be like. That we want to do, somebody that is extremely successful and yet has a flawed character, we tend to not be real attracted to anymore. Vice versa is true. They're such a good man, but they really don't know what they're doing. They're probably not going to be the one we go to for advice. And yet Daniel was a man of exceptional quality. This is what I want. I want Ridge Church to be full of people like this, that are known, that are set apart, that rise above the rest, that are full of character and competency, that really, when people look into our life, can you imagine if this is what identified us as believers? Just a church full of people who literally had flawless character, that people could even look into our lives and find nothing negative to say about us. Man, that would be amazing. But then also that full of people who were extremely competent, who knew what they were doing, who were aware of what's going on in the world and knew how to do something about it, had some solutions, had some fixes. I dream of being the church, the kind of church in our community that the city want to come to. The city officials actually want to come to and ask our advice about what to do about certain things. Why? Because I'm not separate from culture or city or what's going on around us. I want to engage it. Why would we not want to be a part of it? Because we can't change culture if we're not being the culture that we want to create. And that has to be reflected. We have to have some influence. And I want to have influence. It's also what I want for every one of you individually. It's not just a church thing. I would love it if every single one of you was constantly growing and maturing in their faith as believers. It's one thing to sit in a service and encounter Jesus. That's a great place to start, but it cannot end there. It's why we have small groups. It's why we want people plugged in with other people, because we know we grow spiritually when we connect relationally. We watch it happen all the time when we're challenged and we're chiseled by one another. We need each other, and you know it's true. But then I also want people to continue to grow and mature, and it's why we have Navigate. It's why we want people to come through Navigate so that we can help you discover your purpose, see your gifts and your strengths, your core competencies, so that you can discover that and then begin to do something with it so that you can impact people's lives. That's ultimately what we want. That's kind of our flow. Yeah, we want you here, we want you, worshiping and loving Jesus, but ultimately we want to be a group of people who are engaged in culture and making a difference. And that only happens when you find your sweet spot and you're growing and maturing. And yeah, you're not perfect, but people look at your life and go, but there's something about them that I want. There's something that they have that I need. I'm not sure I believe everything they believe, but man, I want to have what they've got. What is it? That's when we create influence. Well, hundreds of years later, Jesus shows up on the scene, and Jesus talks about really these same kind of things, because I think Jesus knew what it meant to create influence. He knew how to engage culture. Do you notice that? I mean, culture just bombarded Jesus all the time. They wanted to hang out with him, the worst of the worst. He didn't so separate himself from culture physically. He separated himself from culture spiritually and through the way that he lived. He knew that that's what makes the difference, that our lives and how we live our lives is ultimately what makes or breaks our ability to influence people. Jesus knew that. And listen to what he said in one of his very first sermons. This is one of the things he was talking about, because nobody was doing it. He said, "You are the salt of the earth. Have you forgotten? What does salt do? Salt makes things taste better. And if you're the salt of the earth, then you should be attractive. You should add flavor to wherever you are. In other words, within the culture where you are, you should make it better. Not resist it and rebel against it, but you should make it better. But if the salt loses its saltiness," and what does that mean? Loses its influence, loses its ability to make a difference, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. That's brutal if you really process that for a second. You put yourself in the equation. I mean, if I'm supposed to be salty, if I'm supposed to be a culture maker, if I lose my saltiness, then I've essentially lost any effectiveness at all, and might as well be trampled underfoot, just thrown away. That doesn't sound real encouraging. That's not what I want to be. If Jesus is talking about us here, and he is, then there needs to be something that makes us stand out. And here's how he said it. He kind of changes the analogy. He says, "You're the light of the world." There's something about you that is a light. In other words, people are watching. People are watching your lives. You are a light, and Jesus wants us to be. Matter of fact, he wants people to see our lives, for it to be on display. That's what he's saying. It should be on display. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl, because that's silly. Instead, they put it on its stand, and what? It gives light to everyone in the house. The purpose of the light is to shine in front of people. I think it's interesting to think that, a monk, kind of that sect of Christianity that takes very seriously the idea of separation from the world and not being of the world, but absolutely just defying culture altogether, avoiding it altogether. Well, what's the purpose of living our lives with character and competency if it's not on display for all to see? Well, nothing, because it doesn't impact it doesn't influence anybody. It's not for us. It's not so that we are good little boys and girls. It's so that people can look at our lives and it gives light to the house. In the same way, let your light, whose light? Your light, shine before others that they may see what? Jesus? No, your good deeds, and glorify your Father in heaven. He's saying, look, let people see your life. The way that you shine your light is by allowing people to peer in and see who you really are. We should not cower in that way. We shouldn't resist that. We shouldn't be concerned about, well, people are being so critical and they're always looking and they think I'm supposed to be perfect. No. They just want to see that there's a difference made in following Jesus. That if we're going to have influence, then there needs to be something different about who we are. Or we've essentially lost our ability to influence people. You see, people don't have to disprove what we believe if they can discredit how we live. They don't have to. They're not even worried about it. They don't care what you think about the Bible. They don't care if you can prove just how true it is if your life isn't different as a result of it. Does that make sense? I mean, this should encourage us and kind of light a fire under us to remind us, look, our lives our lives are what people are looking at. Nobody cares about what the Bible says about their life until they see it making a difference in yours. They want to see that it matters. Is it worth me figuring out? Is it worth me jumping into and putting my faith in? Is it worth me really pursuing this? Because if they don't see any difference about the way you live and the way the rest of the world lives, then what would be the point? You've lost influence. And so we need to regain that. But how do we do that? What does it look like to really gain and sustain influence? Are there some things that we can look at? And I think, honestly, there's probably 1,000 different ways we could go with this. But I wanted to create a picture for us of what this might look like. Because, see, when people look at your life, and if the only picture they see is a religious institution, then they will fail to see God. But if they look at your life and they see character, competency, if they see a difference that is being made in your life, then they begin to see what God is really like. And so what are those ways? What does the picture need to really look like for us? How can we really do this? And again, there are a lot of different things, and we could come up with all kinds of lists. But I wanted to try to simplify it and give us what I feel like is very foundational for who we are. I think if we're going to make a difference, if our responsibility as the church is to know what's going on in order to make a difference, well, in order to make a difference, we have to have influence. So in order to gain influence, I think it just starts with being honest and really loving people. Loving people right where they are. I mean, is this not what Jesus was about? I mean, he talked about it all the time. Just love people. You need to love people right where they are. Let them walk in with all of their yuck and all of their baggage and know that they're loved first. Just like they are, who they are, all of their baggage, all of that mess. If you want to create influence, then create an atmosphere of loving people where they feel like, okay, I don't mind sticking around. I think they genuinely do care for me. Nobody, maybe you've heard it said before, nobody cares what you think until they know how much you love them. Nobody cares how much you know. They just want to know that you love them, and then maybe they're willing to listen. It's where kids are. They won't mind listening so much if they know you really care for them and you have their best interest at heart. They might be willing to listen. And then be willing to serve people. Not just love them, but in humility, serve them. You want to know how to get to the heart of somebody else? Serve them. You want to know how to influence your spouse? Serve them. If you want to know how to influence your children, serve them. If you want to know how to influence your community for Jesus, serve them. If you want to express it, then serve them. And that's why we do things the way we do. It's why we have serve days, because we want to serve. We want to express that to our community, that we're not just here to talk about all the things that we believe. We're here to serve them and to do what Christ did for us. It's why we have a Go team. It's why we've structured ourselves that way around an incredible volunteer base of people who really get it, who want to serve. If you want to figure out, if you want to have a voice, if you want to be able to speak up and to have some level of influence in a church like this, then get on the Go team and begin serving. Jumping out, find those areas, kind of find your sweet spot, and then begin serving people in it. You won't believe what a difference and how much influence you can begin to have in other people's life. It's what kind of distinguishes us and brings us to the surface. And then, wow people. Here's what I mean by that. Impress people with excellence, doing things well. I think this speaks to our competency. In other words, don't be a slacker. Christians, there's no excuse. Well, it's like, but I'm a good Christian. I don't have to be really good at it. No. It means being the best that you can be. If you want to have influence in somebody else's life, I mean raise the bar. Be absolutely skilled and be an expert. Can you imagine? I think we need people like this in every corner of our culture. Christians who are loving people, serving people, but then they are excellent in everything that they do, in the way that they handle things, that they do things well, that they're there early, they stay late, they know exactly what they're doing. There's somebody that you can trust. There's somebody that you can go to, and man, I can ask them for advice, and they always seem to know what to say. Those are the people that you want on your team, isn't it? It's not just because they're good. I want them on my team because they know what they're doing. They're go-getters. They accomplish things. They get things done. They don't whine. They don't even have to be asked. I love people like that. It's why we do what we do. I talk about this at Navigate all the time, and have from the very beginning, that one of our values when it comes to creating a Sunday morning experience is a wow factor. We want to wow people. We want to create such an excellent environment to the best of our ability in a high school that people walk in and go, wow, wasn't expecting that. I thought this was just going to be like normal church. I think it should be this way. It shouldn't create such a wow, but unfortunately it does. Because so many churches are okay with mediocre, because it's just a little bit easier, and we kind of excuse it like, well, that's just because we don't care about all the glitz and glam and we just want to worship. It's like, man, what are we suggesting to the world if we don't put our best foot forward? If we don't work very hard, where people walk in and they go, wow, they held the door for me. Wow, I knew where to go. Wow, my kids really loved being here today. Wow, that music was better than I expected. Wow, I actually understood what was going on. Wow, they talked. I was there for the first time, but I felt comfortable today. They actually talked to me from the stage. Wow. That's the kind of experience I want people to have, and they should have that with us as individual Christians too. Wow. I'm not sure I believe everything they believe, but man, I want them around. I want them on my team. Can I get some more of those Christians like that? Those competent, full of character kind of people? Boy, that distinguishes us, and it creates influence. And then, just foundationally speaking, live different. Our life is on display. Your life is on display for all to see. And people are watching, and they want to know, is it worth my time? Is it making a difference in your life in such a way that I should pursue this, that I should maybe go after this? Does your life look different? Because I think we can engage culture while still standing firm and living holy lives. Lives that are really set apart while very much engaged. Just what Jesus did, isn't it? And we're the body of Christ. It's who we are to be. You want to create sustained influence in somebody's life, then your life should look different. You see it all the time with people who are leaders and, even church leaders, and they've become kind of prominent and everybody kind of knows who they are. And then what happens? All of a sudden, somebody sees into their life and their public life doesn't quite match their private life. And what happens? They lose all influence. The walls, it doesn't mean they're any more of a sinner than we are, right? But they've lost influence at that moment. They've lost the ability to be able to speak into somebody's life. And I don't want that. I want to be the kind of person that if somebody were to really scrutinize and pull back the curtain of my life, that they would see the same person that's standing here before you. It's why I try to be as transparent and honest as I can. Because I want you to see something. I want you to see that who I am here is who I am between Sundays. It's who we all need to be. It's who we're all called to be. Back in 2013, it was our desire to plant a church like this, to create a church that valued these things, that would love people first, like right out of the gate, that created an environment of that where people felt like they could come and be a part of something and belong before they believed, before they got everything fixed. And that it would be a culture of serving people, not being served. That's what we imagined. We imagined a place where people walked in and were wowed. It was like, wow, man, this is excellent. I want to be a part of this. How can I be a part of this? And ultimately, all the while, remaining people who live different lives. Keeping that in check all the time, standing firm, living differently, but keeping all of those things in place. Not judging people who live differently than we do, but instead offering them something, letting them see our lives and being real, being authentic, being transparent. So that's what we did. We launched this church. That's where Ridge Church got its start, with that as our foundation. Here's why. Because we knew that every single week there was going to be somebody walking through our doors who needed to know that all was not lost, that it wasn't too late, that even though you left church a long time ago, that maybe this was a place where you realized, oh, I didn't realize that that's how it was supposed to be. I think I want a part of that. Will you help me? And we knew that was going to happen every week. There may be some of you here today, and that's been your experience. And maybe there's something here that you realize, okay, so I didn't realize, like this has been helpful. I didn't realize that this is what it was about. And so I want in. I want to be a part of that. I'm going to give you an opportunity to step into that relationship today. If you would, just bow your heads with me. And you can pray this prayer right where you are. Prayer does not save you, but a prayer is a declaration saying, this is who I want to be. I want to live like Daniel. I want to be salt, and I want to be light. And I want my life to be on display so that I can create that kind of influence. And if that's what you want, then just confess yourself to Jesus, because he's waiting. Say, Heavenly Father, thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me and creating a way. I know I am messed up. I'm a sinner, and I can't do this on my own. Every time I try to, I fail. And now I see that you still love me just the same. And so I offer myself to you and my life to you, and I confess my sin to you and my brokenness, and I pray that you would enter in and make me whole again. And I pray that you would help me to live my life set apart, distinguished, so that I can be an influence for you. And I pray it in Jesus' name.